Remagen, 3 p.m., 17th March 1945. 200 American engineers and welders are working across the deck of the Ludendorff Bridge when the sound arrives. First a sharp metallic snap, then the deeper groan of tortured steel giving way all at once. The center span drops into the Rhine in a matter of seconds, taking men with it. Lieutenant Colonel Clayton Rust falls into the current and is pulled out alive. 28 of his engineers are not so fortunate. The bridge that had 10 days earlier handed the Allies their first crossing of Germany's last great natural barrier and shortened the war by weeks, in the judgment of commanders on both sides, has finally collapsed under the accumulated weight of bombing, sabotage, and sheer overuse. But by the time it falls, the engineers already know something the wreckage cannot take from them. It no longer matters. This is not where the crossing of the Rhine ends. It is where the real engineering war, the one fought with pontoons and steel trusses instead of rifles, reaches its decisive moment. By the first days of March 1945, Germany's own demolition campaign along the Rhine has been almost total. Of 47 road and rail bridges spanning the river, only 4 remain standing. The Hohenzollern Bridge at Cologne falls on the 6th of March. The bridge at Bonn goes 2 days later. The crossing at Ermitz follows on the 9th. Wehrmacht engineers, under direct order from a high command determined to trade every mile of German soil for time, have turned the Rhine into precisely the obstacle Hitler's generals intended it to be, a 500-mile barrier with almost no way across it left intact. But that was only the beginning of the problem, not the end of it. At Remagen on the 7th of March, the last standing crossing offers the Allies an accident of failure rather than a plan. German charges, nearly 3,000 kilograms of explosives wired beneath the deck, detonate only partially when the demolition order finally comes. Faulty circuitry, rushed wiring, or simple wartime chaos leaves the Ludendorff Bridge damaged but passable, and American forces under Brigadier General William Hoge seize it within the hour, racing infantry and combat engineers across a structure still smoking from the failed detonation. The documents reveal something the popular telling of Remagen usually skips over entirely. Capturing the bridge was, in engineering terms, only the opening move. Aware that a single damaged span could not be trusted to hold 5 armored divisions worth of traffic indefinitely, engineers from the 9th Armored Division and soon after, additional Army combat engineer battalions begin work almost immediately on parallel crossings. A steel treadway bridge and a heavy pontoon bridge, built in the days immediately following the capture, precisely so that the Rhine crossing would not depend on one increasingly fragile structure alone. Another problem soon emerged, one that had nothing to do with German counterattack at all. The Ludendorff Bridge itself was dying by inches. Structural engineers inspecting the span in the days after capture found metal fatigue accelerating under a combination of continuous heavy vehicle traffic, near-constant German artillery and air attack aimed specifically at the bridgehead, and damage from the original demolition attempt that had never been fully repaired, only patched over under fire. The bridge that had made history on the 7th of March was, by the middle of that same month, a structure quietly counting down to its own failure, and everyone directing traffic across it knew it. Erpeler Ley, the 600-foot basalt hill overlooking the eastern end of the bridge, became the fixed point around which this entire drama revolved. The terrain feature every engineering report, every German artillery observer, and every American commander used to orient themselves in the chaos of the bridgehead. Whoever controlled the ground beneath that hill controlled the only reliable route into the heart of industrial Germany, and both sides knew it. Yet the most critical decision had already been made before the bridge ever fell. Rather than treating the Ludendorff Bridge as the singular, irreplaceable asset its capture had seemed to represent, Allied engineering doctrine from the very first hours of the bridgehead assumed its eventual loss. The treadway bridge and pontoon crossing built in parallel were not contingency plans drawn up after the collapse. They were already carrying traffic before the Ludendorff Bridge went down, quietly absorbing the load that the original structure could no longer safely bear alone. What followed the collapse itself was, in a strange way, almost anticlimactic. Within 3 hours of the Ludendorff Bridge falling into the Rhine, combat engineers began work on a floating Bailey Bridge nearby, a modular steel truss design that could be assembled from standardized, interchangeable panels faster than almost any other bridging technology available to either side in the war. By the 20th of March, just 3 days after the collapse, a Bailey Bridge stretching nearly 1,300 feet across the Rhine was open and carrying traffic. A second tactical bridge followed 2 days after that, 5.5 miles upstream, extending the bridgehead's reach even as the original captured crossing became, quite literally, scrap steel scattered across the riverbed. The friction in all of this rarely made it into the official after-action reports, but it shaped every hour of construction. German artillery continued targeting the bridgehead throughout, forcing engineers to work under intermittent bombardment while assembling delicate steel connections that demanded precision the shelling made deliberately difficult to maintain. Floating pontoon sections had to be anchored against the Rhine's current, strong enough to sweep an improperly secured section downstream entirely. Anti-aircraft crews stood permanent watch over the crossing points, aware that a single successful German airstrike against an exposed pontoon bridge could undo days of careful engineering work in seconds. By the 25th of March, 18 days after the original capture, and just 5 days after the Ludendorff Bridge's replacement opened, more than 25,000 Allied troops had crossed into Germany through the Remagen bridgehead, and the breakout east had begun in earnest. The hill at Erpeler Ley, once the fixed point of a desperate defensive stand, now simply marked the edge of territory the Allies had already moved beyond. But one question remained unresolved long after the fighting itself had moved on. What became of the Ludendorff Bridge's wreckage was, for years afterward, treated as an afterthought, twisted steel trusses left where they fell, half submerged in the Rhine, visible to river traffic passing beneath Erpeler Ley for the better part of a decade, before salvage crews finally cleared the worst of it. The structure that had briefly been the most valuable piece of engineering in the entire European theatre spent its final years as scrap nobody had yet found the time or the budget to remove. A quiet postscript to a bridge that had, for 18 days in March 1945, decided the shape of the war's final weeks. Debriefing assessed as a combat engineering problem rather than a purely tactical one, the Rhine crossing at Remagen reveals 3 defining pressures and one enduring lesson in operational planning. First, German demolition doctrine succeeded almost completely in principle, destroying 43 of 47 crossings, yet failed at the single point that mattered most, a partial detonation at Remagen that handed the Allies exactly the opening German planners had worked for months to deny them. Second, Allied engineering doctrine treated redundancy as the actual objective, rather than the captured bridge itself. Building parallel treadway and pontoon crossings before the Ludendorff Bridge failed, rather than after, meant its eventual collapse became a manageable transition rather than a crisis, a lesson in planning for failure that shaped Allied river crossing doctrine for the remainder of the war. Third, the speed of Bailey Bridge construction, a replacement span open within 3 days of losing the original crossing entirely, demonstrated the value of standardized modular engineering over improvised repair, a design philosophy that would go on to influence military bridging equipment for decades after the guns at Remagen fell silent. The enduring lesson sits, quite literally, in the wreckage still visible in old photographs of the Rhine at Erpeler Ley. The bridge that made history was never expected to survive its own success, and the engineers who built its replacements before it fell understood something the bridge's German defenders never fully grasped. In a river crossing, the structure that matters most is rarely the one still standing. It is the one already under construction behind it,